The person on the other end of the phone seemed really excited. I watched the typing indicator on the chat box stay there for 3 minutes. Finally, I couldn't hold it in and sent another message. The tulips in the garden must be really beautiful when I get back. Also, I miss you a lot. This time, instead of typing, the other party sent a voice message with a tone full of affection and indulgence. Got it. Our Oliver is even more delicate than the tulips. Everything has been arranged to your liking. The conversation ended. I skillfully deleted the phone messages, turned off the phone, and lay in bed tossing and turning. The maid had gone back to the nanny's room to rest. The whole villa was empty, leaving me alone like a lonely ghost. The moonlight shone through the gap in the curtains onto the wedding photo of Matthew and me, giving off a cold and pale vibe. The alpha had a handsome face, and his eyes showed a cynical look, looking rather casual. S-class alphas are born at the top of the pyramid, looking down on everything. But I've seen with my own eyes how he was cautious and gentle as silk in front of another inferior omega. There was a nice rose fragrance floating in the air, the same as James' pheromone. I only want to get drunk in the rose fragrance. When Matthew said this, the gardener was clearing the tulips in the garden as he instructed. The snow-white bulbs were exposed to the scorching sun, gradually becoming shriveled and withered, just like my gland that emits tulip-scented pheromone. Without love, it would wither sooner or later. 3 years into the marriage, Matthew didn't even want to give me a temporary mark. Before, I could barely hold on with inhibitors, but I never expected that high-compatibility S-class alphas and omegas could have children without a lifetime mark. After having the baby, my desire for the alpha's pheromone couldn't be suppressed by inhibitors anymore. Just today, I fainted again due to pregnancy-related reactions and was sent to the hospital of Matthew's childhood friend. When Matthew came, I was already awake, but it was a severe period of pregnancy-related reactions, and I really didn't have the strength to deal with his sarcasm, so I chose to pretend to be unconscious to avoid trouble. Yo, did James scratch your neck again? Matthew, you're really ruthless. Your wife is unconscious while pregnant, and you don't even mark her. Matthew replied through gritted teeth. Mark him? Does Oliver deserve it? If James didn't like his pheromones, I would have kicked him in the stomach long ago. Then why did you let him get pregnant? Matthew sneered. Even the most obedient dog needs a bone thrown its way, doesn't it? The other person seemed a bit reluctant and said, You're being too cruel. He's your lawfully wedded wife, and now he's even carrying your child. Matthew suddenly flew into a rage. What, are you going to force me to accept Oliver like those old geezers? So what if there's a high compatibility? I'll never be controlled by pheromones. In a few more days, he should step aside. I thought my heart was as dead as ashes, but after Matthew's outburst, my heart still couldn't help but ache. Matthew, I have my pride too. When going through the hospital discharge procedures, I politely thanked the doctor and pretended not to understand the pity and sigh in his eyes. I gently stroked my slightly bulging abdomen. Baby, having you is enough for me. This morning, Matthew actually sat at the dining table having breakfast, which was a rare sight. I hesitated, and my steps became heavy, but when I met his cold gaze, I obediently sat at the other end of the dining table, as far away from him as possible. He tapped his knuckles on the rim of the coffee cup, and the wedding ring glinted with a cold metallic sheen in the morning light. The scent of spring soil after the rain, mixed with the aroma of roses, turned into an invisible monster, pouncing at me menacingly from him. Last night, he and James had another night of passion. James took just 1 year to put an end to my 3-year marriage. I wasn't sure if it was due to my feelings or the high compatibility, but my eyes became misty, and I couldn't help but get teary. This layer of mist turned into a stone, weighing down on my heart. I ate my breakfast numbly, tasted like cardboard. Matthew had already finished eating and was lighting up a cigarette, looking quite pleased with himself. The smell of tobacco spread in the air and I couldn't help coughing. Damn it, he suddenly sneered. Only then did I realize that my vision was blurred by tears, and teardrops plopped onto the fried egg. He walked over to my seat, leaned in suddenly, and with his tobacco-scented fingers, he grabbed my chin. Who are you trying to look pitiful for? I said timidly. I didn't mean to. It's the pheromone repulsion. The cigarette butt was stubbed out on the untouched toast, and the scorch mark looked like a centipede. The doctor will come this afternoon. The sound of him slamming the door made the new maid drop the vase in her hand. Remember to keep your disgusting pheromones in check, he said. Mr. Oliver, I'm sorry. The maid looked terrified at the broken pieces on the floor. The butler stood by with a face as dark as thunder, looking like he was about to lash out. It's okay. It's just a decoration. Seeing that I wasn't going to hold it against her, the butler went to attend to other matters. It's funny to say, I'm like a weed in Matthew's eyes, but as long as I'm still his legal omega, he won't allow the hired help to look down on me, just like no one dares to look down on the family parrot, Yaoi. The maid was nervously cleaning up, with tears welling up in her round eyes. I was a bit puzzled. Are you that timid? It's all over now. To my surprise, she burst into tears. Mr. Oliver, I'm quitting after today. The butler might be a bit strict, but he manages things well and there's no bullying going on. And Matthew offers good pay. Her behavior is a bit out of the ordinary. It seems more like she's been forced to leave after learning some big secret. Also, she seems really scared of Matthew. I sighed, pulled out a tissue and handed it to her. You're afraid of Matthew, aren't you? She froze for a moment, her voice trembling. I was new here and didn't know the rules. I went into the study to clean and found a document. At this point, she suddenly grabbed my shoulder. Mr. Oliver, run. If you don't, your glands and your child will belong to someone else. They only see you as a vessel to give birth to a top-notch alpha. I looked down at my phone as she indicated. On the lit screen, my name was clearly signed on the gland transplant surgery consent form. Matthew has stooped so low as to forge signatures for James. Love really is something that makes people lose control. I wish all alphas in the world were love-struck fools. The little nanny was still looking at me worriedly, but I calmly started eating bird's nest. Your name is Yuan, right? Before you leave tomorrow, please help me take all the photos, including the wedding photos, to the dump and burn them. I don't want any of my images to appear in this house again. Are you planning to leave? I shook my head, turned around, and put all the gold jewelry I bought when I got married into a garbage bag, then handed it to Yuan. After dealing with the photos, take this bag of trash and leave the city. Remember, you're leaving just because you can't adapt to the job. You know nothing about the employer's affairs. Also, you're afraid of Matthew, but you've never really known me. Another late night, Matthew was still out, fooling around with James and not coming home. I quietly sneaked into the study, fished out a tiny camera from the rose pot that was almost indistinguishable from the shoots. The shooting angle was right at the desk. My fingertips got smeared with the soil from the rose roots. It was disgustingly sticky. This rose was a gift James sent last year. Matthew would never check it. After all this, as usual, I fiddled with the computer for half an hour, skillfully deleted the videos that were unfavorable to me taken by the surveillance Matthew set up, and inserted fake videos instead. Just before going to bed, I got another message from overseas. Why'd you take down the camera? Did he find out you were spying on him? I yawned lazily and typed slowly. The play's about to end. Oliver's gonna die, and William's gonna go home. I stood by the shelf, pinching a sunflower seed between my fingertips, teasing Yaoi. Yaoi, come here. The turquoise parrot tilted its head, his beady eyes fixed on me. Suddenly, it flapped its wings and flew onto my shoulder, nuzzling my cheek affectionately. Oliver, Oliver. It squawked in the tone I'd once taught it. I couldn't help but laugh, gently stroking its soft feathers with my fingertip. Yaoi was adopted by Matthew and me right after we got married. Matthew wasn't the cold-hearted guy he is now. When I was feeding the parrot, he'd wrap his arms around my waist from behind, rest his chin on my shoulder, and laugh lazily. Oliver, try teaching it to say my name. I deliberately teased him, saying Matthew sounds so ugly. How about jerk instead? He chuckled softly, then suddenly bit my earlobe, his warm breath fanning my neck. Say husband. The memory came to an abrupt halt, because the next second, James' voice came from the doorway. Oliver, long time no see. My fingers froze, and Zhao Kai immediately perked up its feathers warily, letting out a low gurgling sound in its throat. James strolled in leisurely, and the scent of roses instantly filled the entire living room. He was wearing a light-colored V-neck sweater today, which made his neck look slender. There were mottled hickeys all over it, but no sign of a lifetime mark. I stroked Xiaotsai's little head soothingly. Thanks to you, I'm still alive. He let out a soft laugh and walked straight to the sofa and sat down, his posture as lazy as a spoiled cat. Matthew's not home today. I came here especially to check on you. Me? You came to see me? I raised my eyes and my gaze landed on his wrist, where there was a watch woven with gold and gems, an antique that Matthew had bought at an auction last month. Yeah, James shook his wrist. After all, the kid in your belly will have to call me dad someday. The air suddenly froze. I stared at him and couldn't help but laugh. James, Matthew didn't mark me, but he also didn't give you a permanent mark because he despises your low rank. But fortunately, legally, I'm still his legitimate spouse. Legally, James seemed to have heard a joke. He suddenly leaned in close and whispered in my ear, Oliver, you really think a marriage certificate can protect you? Matthew has already made arrangements. It won't be long before everything you have is mine. Before he could finish, Zhao Kai suddenly shrieked, Homewrecker! James was startled and instinctively shrank back. Then, in a fit of rage, he tried to come up and teach Zhao Kai a lesson. Who are you calling a homewrecker? The one who isn't loved is the real third wheel. I used my body to separate him and looked down at him, speaking softly. James, you've only known him for a year, while I've been married to him for 3. I know him better than you do. I took a deep breath and said what I'd been holding back for a long time. My husband, Matthew, he's of bad character and low morals. He hates me, the wife arranged by his elders, because it was a compromise when he had no power. Once you take my place, you'll be worse off than me, because he won't be able to stand people pointing fingers at him for abandoning his wife, and he'll shift all the blame onto you. His face changed several times, and he became completely manic, lunging at me with wild gestures. You're jealous. You're slandering him. He loves me. He wouldn't do that. Zhao Kai was frightened and let out a sharp scream. His sharp claws dug deep into the back of James' hand. Ah! James let out a cry of pain, and 3 bloodstains instantly appeared on his fair hand. I immediately shielded Zhao Kai in my arms and looked at him coldly. You got what you deserved. He stared at me fiercely, then suddenly raised his voice. Matthew! Look at him. I was startled and turned to look at the door. Matthew had somehow returned and was standing there with a gloomy face. The air seemed to freeze instantly. James immediately rushed over, and tears started streaming down his face. Matthew! Oliver let the parrot scratch me. Matthew looked down at the bloodstains on his hand, and his eyes suddenly turned cold. Oliver! His voice was soft but cut like a knife. Give me the bird. I hugged Zhao Kai tighter and took a step back. James started it. I said. Matthew stepped closer, his eyes seething with rage. Give me the bird. Zhao Kai trembled in my arms, and a few frightened gurgles came from its throat. I stared intently at Matthew. What do you want? He suddenly let out a cold laugh, snatched Zhao Kai from me, and roughly grabbed its neck. Matthew! I lunged forward to grab it, but he pushed me away. Just a beast. How dare it hurt James? He looked down at Zhao Kai with disgust. Since it's not obedient, send it back to the circus. Felt like all the blood in my body froze. What? Matthew had already turned around and walked out. James sneered at me triumphantly and quickly followed. Matthew! I rushed forward and grabbed his sleeve, my voice trembling. Zhao Kai got depression in the circus back then and was rescued. We raised it together. You can't. We. He suddenly shook off my hand, his eyes mocking. Oliver, who the hell do you think you are? You don't deserve to say we. I froze on the spot. Matthew walked away without looking back. Zhao Kai fluttered desperately in his hands, its shrill cries fading away all the way until it disappeared outside the door. Oliver, Oliver, Dad, Dad. I blankly opened my palm. Xiaotsai's feathers were still warm. It only calls me Dad when it's extremely anxious. Scalding tears dropped onto my palm, wetting the feathers. Zhao Kai must be so scared right now. "You took down the wedding photo?" I was lying in bed, listless, too lazy to pay attention to Matthew. Sensing his approach, I irritably covered my head with the quilt. "Get up. Stop playing dead. Don't you care about that bird's life or death?" Hearing this, I sat up and stared straight at the face that I had dreamed of cutting into pieces. "What's the condition?" "The day after tomorrow, go deep-sea fishing with me." "Okay." My answer without the slightest hesitation caught him off guard. Then, he wore a smile of ambiguous meaning. "You really care a lot about that beast, because even beasts are more noble than you." I didn't look at his ugly-looking face and lay back on the bed to sleep again. He stood by my bedside in silence for a long time, then finally left. I relaxed completely and drifted off into a deep sleep. It rained on the day of the sea fishing. I stared at the boat trip consent form. The paper was soaked by the rain, its edges curling up. The cigarette between Matthew's fingers glowed on and off in the night, and his eyes were colder than the sea breeze. "Matthew, I agreed to the sea fishing, but not to going to international waters." "Sign it," he repeated, impatiently nudging the iron cage with the tip of his leather shoe. Yaoi was huddled at the bottom of the cage, its feathers wet and sticking to its body, and its right wing hanging unnaturally. Hearing my voice, it struggled to lift its head. Its bean-like eyes glimmered faintly in the darkness. "Dad," croaked weakly, the sound almost drowned out by the rain. I crouched down, slipped my fingertips through the cage bars, and gently touched its beak. It immediately rubbed against my hand, a low whine coming from its throat. "Okay." I looked up at Matthew, my voice calm. "I'll sign." A sneer curved his lips, as if he had long expected I had no other choice. James stood behind him, a smile on his lips, his fingertips unconsciously rubbing the inhibitor patch on the back of his neck. His eyes were fixed on me, like a venomous snake eyeing its prey, so excited that he was almost trembling. I took the pen and signed my name at the end of the document. Matthew gathered up the papers and casually tossed them to the bodyguard behind him. Then he bent down, picked up the cage, and waved it in front of me. "Get on board." He turned and walked towards the yacht, his tone leaving no room for argument. "The parrot's yours." The interior of the yacht's cabin was dimly lit, and a faint smell of disinfectant hung in the air. I held Yaoi in my arms, gently smoothing its ruffled feathers with my fingertips. It was shivering in my arms, and the injury to its wing made it difficult for it to even stand. Matthew was leaning against the bar, sipping his drink, while James was sitting on the sofa, head down, fiddling with his phone and chuckling from time to time. "The medical team is on the second floor," Matthew suddenly said, his eyes landing on me, as if sizing up an item. "A professor will give you a check-up later." My fingertips stopped, and I looked up at him. "What kind of check-up?" He sneered but didn't answer. However, James looked up, wearing a sweet smile. "Of course, it's a routine pregnancy check-up. Matthew is worried about the baby." His tone was sickeningly affectionate. I didn't move, just lowered my head to stroke Yaoi's feathers and said softly, "I don't need it." Matthew's eyes suddenly turned cold. "Oliver." He put down his glass, and the bottom of the glass clinked crisply against the marble countertop. "Don't make me say it again." The air froze. I was silent for a few seconds, then finally stood up and gently placed Yaoi on the sofa. It let out a nervous squawk and its claws hooked onto my sleeve. "Be good. Wait for me to come back," I whispered soothingly, then looked at Matthew. "After the checkup, the parrot is mine." He stared at me, then suddenly smiled. "Of course." The corridor on the second floor was long and narrow, with dark blue emergency lights embedded in the walls. The bodyguard led me to the end and pushed open a thick metal door. Inside, under the glaring incandescent lights, several people in surgical gowns were adjusting the instruments. The operating table in the center glowed coldly, and on the tray next to it, the scalpels were neatly arranged. I stopped in my tracks. "Mr. Oliver." A doctor wearing a mask came up, speaking gently. "Please lie down. We need to give you an anesthetic injection." I took a step back, my back pressing against the cold wall. "Just a checkup?" I asked softly. The doctor's eyes flickered, then he smiled and said, "Yes, just a checkup." I looked at the display screen beside the operating table, and there was clearly a 3D simulation diagram of a gland transplantation surgery on it. the process of removing the tulip gland, with every step clearly marked. It's really ridiculous. Such clumsy tactics. It seems Matthew really takes me for a fool. Just before the anesthetic was pushed into my vein, I heard a loud bang in the distance. The whole yacht shook violently, and the alarm pierced the night sky. "What's going on?" the doctor shouted sharply. A panicked shout came from the walkie-talkie. "Pirates! There are pirates attacking." There was another explosion. The light tube on the ceiling shattered, and debris flew everywhere. I saw the doctor and the nurse rush towards the door in a panic, and the operating room door was slammed shut. In the distance, gunshots and screams mingled together. The yacht tilted. I struggled to roll off the operating table and knocked over the instrument rack. Needles and scalpels scattered all over the floor. My palm was cut, and blood trickled down. I couldn't help but suck in a breath and cursed inwardly. This is too rough. They should have taken me away first. I stumbled outside and saw that the deck was ablaze with fire and thick smoke billowing. Matthew and James were standing next to the lifeboat. Several bodyguards were escorting them to board the boat. Fortunately, Yaoi was in the hands of one of the bodyguards. "Mr. Matthew, the lifeboat can't hold so many people." James's face was deathly pale. He held Matthew's arm tightly, while Matthew's eyes swept to the other end of the deck. There was a helicopter parked there, and its propellers had already started to spin. But it could only take one more person. Matthew didn't hesitate. He grabbed James and pushed him towards the helicopter. "Matthew!" James shouted in panic. "Get on!" Matthew commanded sharply, then turned to the pilot and shouted, "Take him away." The moment the helicopter took off, I held onto the railing and met Matthew's eyes. He saw me, but he just glanced at me. Then he turned around and jumped onto the lifeboat. The yacht exploded behind me, and the heat waved through me into the sea. The cold seawater rushed into my nose and mouth. In the last moment before I lost consciousness, I thought, thankfully, Yaoi was saved. Thankfully, I had put on the special protective suit my father sent in advance. Also, Dad's people really put on a big show. It's just a pity that I didn't have time to blow up Matthew and James, those two scoundrels. When I woke up, the tulips outside the window were in full bloom. The sunlight spilled on the floor, and the whole room was filled with warmth. A tall and straight figure stood in front of my bed against the light, where his gland should have been on his neck. There was only a faint scar that was hard to notice unless you looked closely. Looking at him, my nose suddenly felt sour. "Dad!" He turned around, revealing a face that resembled mine but carried the marks of time. His warm palm stroked the stray hairs on my forehead. My father's tone was filled with distress and reproach. "Oliver, you've suffered." I shook my head, took his hand, and placed it on my swollen abdomen. "It's not hard, Dad. Our Lee family has a new heir. He's a top-notch Omega, just like you and me." His fingers tightened slightly, and a trace of pain flashed in his eyes, but it was quickly replaced by coldness. He bent down to tuck the blanket around me, and his voice was as hoarse as sandpaper rubbing. "But Dad is really scared. Scared that you'll follow in my footsteps and become a Usul." "Dad!" I quickly interrupted his increasingly gloomy words and lowered my head to expose the gland at the back of my neck. "Look, my gland is intact. Your people arrived in time. It won't be like what happened to you back then." My voice stopped abruptly. My father's tears were dropping onto my neck, so scalding that it made my heart tremble. This man has carried so much. In public, he's the head of a top-notch family, enjoying boundless glory. But in private, he has to endure the mockery of being called a useless person with a defective gland. He had once been a top-tier Omega, but due to a family arranged marriage, he married my biological father. That complete devil, that alpha tortured him with the most despicable means, marking him again and again, and then forcing him to get cleaned again and again. If it hadn't been for me being held hostage, how could someone as proud as him have submitted? An accident occurred during the last cleaning operation, and his gland was completely damaged. That devil was finally imprisoned for intentional injury and soon died in prison. And I finally returned to my father's side. When I was young, I always wanted to ask him, Was it worth it to deliberately destroy his gland during the operation in order to raise me without scruples and send that devil to prison? But before I could ask, my grandfather wanted to betroth me to the retarded young master of the Wei family. My father was silent for a long time and finally only postponed the engagement for 1 year. But I was destined to have nothing to do with the Wei family. Because my father, Sebastian, that Omega who had once been looked down upon by the family, had already woven an inescapable net in the dark. He defeated those alpha uncles one by one, invited his father-in-law to rest in a separate courtyard, and finally took control of the Lee family's power. Oliver became my nickname. My father gave me a new given name, William, and designated me as the next generation head. He protected me very well. Before I grew strong enough, he never let me be exposed in front of others. When I left the scope of his protection, I lived and socialized as Oliver, an orphan. I remember on my 18th birthday, my father was sitting in the courtyard, his fingertips rubbing the hideous scar on his gland, and his tone was so calm that it was almost cold. Oliver, although my marriage was a mistake, I don't want you to be afraid of love because of it. I grabbed the cuff of his sleeve and asked in a low voice, but what if he turns bad like that person later? My father suddenly laughed, and the fine lines at the corners of his eyes hid the ease after going through hardships. He pinched my cheek. What are you afraid of? The Lee family, can always afford to lose. When in love, go all out. But if one day he's not worthy of you, he paused, picked up the teacup and took a sip. Just consider him a high-quality gene provider. After all, with such a large family business of the Lee family, there always needs to be an heir. The teacup landed on the pear-wood table with a clear clatter. Later, I met Matthew at the foot of Mount Fuji. The early spring cherry blossoms hadn't bloomed yet. He stood in front of the snow-covered mountain slope and took off his scarf to wrap it around my frost-bitten ears. At that moment, the tenderness in his eyes was just like the young Omega in my father's treasured old photos, the one who hadn't been destroyed by marriage. On the 7th day of our acquaintance, he kissed me under the vermilion torii gate of Sengen Shrine and said we were destined to be together with a pheromone compatibility as high as 98%. I believed him, but after we got married, I found him flirting around, always surrounded by women. He started to tear off his well-dressed disguise, grabbed my chin and sneered, "If it weren't for your high-rated glands, do you think I'd touch an orphan? If it weren't for the old folks at home fancying our high compatibility, would I have bothered to marry you?" Dad was right. Love is just a small thing in life, and revenge, that's the big deal. The shadowless lamp in the delivery room was blindingly white. My fingers gripping the bedsheet turned blue at the knuckles. "Mr. William, the anesthesiologist will be here soon." "No need." I bit down on the cork that was handed to me. Cold sweat on my forehead soaked the pillow. "Set up the tablet." Dad silently took the tablet and tapped the screen twice with his fingertips. The live stream of the memorial service on the other side of the ocean instantly filled the whole screen. Matthew, dressed in a black morning suit, stood in front of my huge portrait, a white rose pinned to his chest. James, with red-rimmed eyes, stood half a step behind him. Oliver loved the sea the most during his lifetime. Matthew choked up in front of the camera. His wedding ring sparkled under the spotlight. He was resting on the second floor of the yacht that day. If only I could have been faster. He paused at just the right moment, his Adam's apple bobbing as he swallowed his grief. Even the veins bulging on the side of his neck seemed to be part of a carefully crafted act. Labor pains came like a tide. I arched my body and let out a muffled groan. My nails scratched red marks on Dad's hand. "Oliver, don't watch this anymore." Dad tried to turn off the live stream, but I grabbed his wrist tightly. "I want to watch." I gasped and laughed. "Watch how he mourns for me." On the screen, Matthew was leaning over to stroke Xiaotsai's feathers. The parrot huddled listlessly in the golden cage, showing no reaction to the nuts held to its beak. "Xiaokai has refused to talk since Oliver left." Matthew sighed into the camera, his fingertip grazing Xiaotsai's broken wing bone. "I'll take care of it for the rest of its life." With a click, I crushed the cork. How ridiculous. The alpha who was stingy enough not to even give me a temporary mark during my lifetime was now acting like a lovesick fool after my death. "The baby's head is showing." Mr. William, push harder. In excruciating pain, I stared intently at the screen. Matthew was displaying the relics of my late husband. A diamond bracelet I had never seen before. This was custom made for our wedding anniversary last year. Unfortunately, I didn't have time to give it to him, he said, his eyes downcast in a way that was sickeningly affectionate. Now I can only burn it for him. Burn it for his father. I suddenly grabbed the handrail of the delivery bed tightly and, amidst the midwife's cries of alarm, exerted a sudden burst of strength. Blood soaked through the bedsheet, and the pain tore at my internal organs, but I laughed until I trembled. It's out! The baby's loud wail pierced the delivery room. My father's hand trembled as he cut the umbilical cord. The nurse held the blood-smeared little one in front of me. It's a beautiful Omega boy, with a gland rating of S+. I reached out to touch the baby's nape, where a fresh summer grass scent was wafting. Exactly the same as the pheromone of my father's gland before it was destroyed. Bloodline is really a magical thing. What my father had lost was carried on in my child. Michael. I kissed his wrinkled little face. My baby will be called Michael from now on. On the screen, the memorial service was coming to an end. Matthew's eyes were red in front of the reporter's cameras. I will never remarry in this life, he vowed to my portrait, but his fingers unconsciously rubbed the side of James's waist. My father turned off the tablet and wiped my sweat-soaked forehead with a warm towel. Sleep. When you wake up, it'll be their turn to lose sleep. I looked at Michael in the crib and chuckled, hoping that the next time we met, Matthew's acting skills would be even better. When the postpartum month ended, my father carefully organized Michael's gland test report and put it in the innermost drawer of the study. S+ grade, grassy fragrance, just like me back then. Father's slender fingertips slowly stroked the gilded badge on the report. Suddenly, he let out a low laugh, the sound laced with ice. Oliver, do you think Matthew would go crazy if he knew that the child he abandoned with his own hands is a top-tier Omega? I was bending down to adjust Michael's swaddle. Hearing this, I looked up. Outside the French window, the early summer tulips swayed in the wind, with night dew still glistening on their petals. He won't. I lowered my head and gently kissed Michael's soft forehead. The grass-scented pheromone gently coiled like a thin mist. The child's eyelashes fluttered slightly in his sleep, like the fragile wings of a butterfly. The Shin family is even dirtier than the Lee family back then. Only that fool James would believe Matthew's so-called sincerity and willingly lie on the operating table, letting him cut the glands again and again. The air suddenly froze. Father silently rubbed the edge of the report until the paper made a faint, crisp sound. News came from the country. James' gland replacement surgery was successful. His voice was heavy. Now he's a top-tier Omega, but multiple gland replacement surgeries have ruined his health. He won't live through this winter. Suddenly, Michael in the cradle smacked his lips, and his chubby little hand unconsciously grabbed the corner of my clothes. Moonlight filtered through the gauze curtain and fell on his face, gilding the downy hair silver white. My child is an Omega, and he has an enviable S+ gland. If I had no power or influence, would my child also fall into the hands of someone like Matthew? Dad, Matthew is a heartless beast. I gently pried Michael's fingers open and left a kiss on his cheek. Back then, he wanted to use me and James to test the surgical plan for the gland black market. Once it was successful, how many children from ordinary families would become lambs to the slaughter? James' surgery means that this industrial chain has started to operate. Dad, the Lee family should return to the country. Father carefully covered Michael with a thin fleece blanket. When he picked up his phone, I saw the veins bulging on the back of his hand. As planned, extend an olive branch to the Shin family. When Matthew received the cooperation intention thrown by the Lee family, he was showing his goods in a basement in the suburbs. Under the pale white light, over a dozen alphas and omegas were chained to the wall, with price tags pasted on the gland area at the back of their necks. The son of a wealthy merchant was using his ring-laden hand to fiddle with the eyelids of an unconscious teenager, as if choosing livestock. Mr. Matthew, the Lee family, on the tablet screen handed by the assistant. Father's profile at the signing ceremony was as cold as a knife. The golden font of the financial headline was so dazzling that it hurt the eyes. A multi-billion-dollar biotech park settled in city. The overseas Lee family makes a strong comeback. This guy looks kind of familiar. Matthew suddenly gripped the tablet tightly, his knuckles turning white. A familiar face flashed through his mind, then quickly slipped away. The son of the wealthy businessman leaned over and took a glance, then sneered. Just an old man with a defective gland. Only his face is worth looking at. Matthew didn't respond. He unconsciously twirled his pinky ring until the assistant bent down and whispered, "The young master of the Lee family is quite interested in your parrot," he said. "He likes loyal little pets like Hachiko." 3 days later, Yaoi was locked in a solid gold birdcage. A red silk ribbon was tied into an exaggerated bow on top of the cage. Matthew personally carried the cage and stood in the Lee family's courtyard, dressed in a suit and tie. Even his cufflinks were replaced with black onyx for mourning. How ironic. He was already mourning himself. I stood in the shadow of the second-floor terrace, wearing a silver mask. Everyone knew that William, the young master of the Lee family, was disfigured by his father's rival during a family power struggle in his childhood. Mr. William, he tilted his head up, showing just the right amount of eagerness, as if the person who had coldly watched me fall into the sea on the yacht back then was someone else. Yaoi is very intelligent. I heard you. Leave it there. I deliberately roughened my voice, making it rasp like sandpaper. The Yaoi in the cage suddenly thrashed violently, its damaged right wing slamming against the golden bars with a loud clatter. The small, black bean-like eyes stared fixedly at me. As its beak opened and closed, it managed to squeeze out a trembling call. "Dad! Dad!" A look of joy spread across Matthew's face. He hasn't spoken a word since my lover passed away. He even hurt himself. It seems you and Yaoi are destined to be together, Mr. William. I reached out and stroked Yaoi's sparse feathers. It immediately buried its head in my palm, making a whimpering sound like a baby animal. The bandage on its broken wing oozed a pale yellow pus, wetting my fingertips. Destiny is indeed a strange thing. My father slowly walked out from behind the corridor pillar. The cooperation intention document made a crisp sound as he opened it in his hand. "Mr. Matthew, how about we talk about business?" When Matthew's gaze stuck to the amount at the end of the contract, I clearly heard his suddenly heavy breathing. Late at night, I unwrapped the festering wound of Yaoi. When the alcohol cotton ball touched the rotten flesh, it shivered all over, but it always gently combed my cufflinks with its beak, as if to comfort me. "Silly thing," I flicked its bald head. "Staying with someone like that, even your feathers have lost their luster." Yaoi suddenly struggled and flew towards the spiral staircase. Its broken wing made a clumsy arc in the air. The nanny was coming downstairs, holding Michael in her arms. It landed crookedly on her shoulder and stared intently at the baby's swaddle with its black eyes. "Baby, baby, warm. This is really nice." My father's voice suddenly came from behind. The moonlight filtered through the dome glass, bathing Yaoi's mangled wings, Michael's waving little hand, and the nanny's smiling eyes in a gentle blue. I looked at my distorted reflection in the glass and softly replied, "When Matthew is dead, it will be even better." "Dad," the people we had lying in wait at the Shin family's place rescued James. "We've got a witness now." I rushed excitedly towards the study, eager to share this good news with Dad, only to find him staring blankly at a glass gift box on the desk. It was a sea turtle specimen covered in barnacles. "Dad, who on earth sent such a creepy thing?" Matthew, he snapped back to reality, took out his cigarette case, and as the smell of tobacco spread, his expression turned playful. "I just mentioned to him my distress about my gland being damaged, and he sent me this, inviting me to his suburban farm in 3 days, saying I could pick any gland I wanted there." The tip of the cigarette glowed on and off. "This specimen is the ticket. People who have the specimen will form an alliance to protect its members." Ah, what a pleasant surprise. I was just worried about not being able to expose them all. The darker their hearts, the bolder they get, but the stupider they become. Just like your uncle and those guys, equally bad. I gently walked up to Dad and pressed my cheek against his warm embrace. "It's all over, Dad." James's skin on the operating table was ashen, and the scent of roses was tinged with the smell of decay. My gloved fingertips pressed against the back of his neck. Under the electron microscope, the gland that had been replaced several times looked like a moldy wad of cotton. "You're Oliver." he suddenly grabbed my wrist, and his dilated pupils reflected the spotlights of the operating lamp. I sneered. What? Planning to tattle on your savior to Matthew? Unusually, he didn't lash out at me. Instead, he just murmured, I'm done for. This body is at its end. This is my retribution. Retribution. When he said the word retribution, his face suddenly twisted with resentment. Why should I be the only one going to hell? Matthew deserves to be hacked to pieces. I thought that if I got a high-grade gland, I could marry him, but he treated me like a lab monkey. A sharp pain shot through my wrist, and James's throat made a heh-heh sound, like the creaking of an old and used bellows. Oliver, after I'm gone, make good use of my body. This body that's been through multiple gland replacement surgeries is evidence of Matthew's crimes. The pain in my wrist suddenly vanished, and James's hand dropped limply. The doctor came in and announced the end of his life. That once arrogant Omega had paid the ultimate price of his life just because he fell in love with a scumbag. If I hadn't stayed clear-headed back then, I probably wouldn't have ended up any better. On the day Dad was supposed to meet Matthew to pick a gland, dozens of police cars roared up and surrounded Matthew's suburban farm. By the time the reporters caught wind and arrived, the doctor's stretchers were already filled with rescued, battered alphas and omegas. The police even found the buried bodies of victims in the farm's rose garden. This scene was like a living hell, with all the evidence and witnesses for every single incident. The Shin family was ruined, and those who bought glands from Matthew were caught one by one, awaiting nothing but legal judgment. But Matthew hadn't been caught yet. He didn't show up at all that day. No one knew when he'd sensed something was wrong. In the police office, the smell of mint fragrance mixed with the printer ink. The criminal investigation captain pushed the protection plan in front of me for the third time. Matthew is proficient in gland camouflage technology. The body found at the dock last week has been confirmed to be a substitute. Mr. Lee, you can apply to the police for 24-hour close protection. I lowered my head, finished the water in the paper cup, and gave a grateful smile to the person across from me. No need, I can handle it. It's not illegal to cause death in special self-defense. How could I miss the chance to take revenge on Matthew myself? In the reflection of the glass window of the baby store, Matthew emerged from behind the shelf, wearing a bite stopper. William? Or should I call you Oliver? He ripped off the isolation collar on my nape and started suppressing me with pheromones. I pretended to collapse beside the milk powder shelf. He half carried me out of the baby store and to an unfinished building. You know what? Matthew took out a syringe. I've prepared a gift for you. A flash of cold light. When the syringe was about to touch my skin, I moved. Matthew twitched and fell to the ground. I couldn't help but hit him a few more times with the electric shock self-defense device in the shape of a baby bottle. The syringe in his hand happened to stab into his own gland when he fell. When the police arrived, Matthew was already foaming at the mouth. There was poison in the syringe. I won't tell anyone that when I shocked Matthew, I deliberately found the right angle and used the right amount of force so that when he fell, he would stab himself. Although I originally wanted to use a dagger to stab him all over, this method of using his own strength against him was more reliable. 3 years after Matthew was brought to justice, at the launch event of the Lee family's medical enterprise, I pressed the start button. The non-invasive gland surgical device emitted light waves, and the large screen showed in real time the gland changes of the Omega volunteers. The alpha pheromones were moving under the skin, but no longer triggered any pheromone fluctuations. This meant that as long as the Omegas were willing, they had a chance to break free from their submission to alpha pheromones. Mom! Michael, who was already 3.5 years old, rushed backstage, holding up a science award from kindergarten. The pheromone paintbrush I invented can turn smells into colors. I looked out the window. The sanatorium where James had once been imprisoned had been transformed into a gland museum. My father walked in, carrying Zhaokai. The bird's beak gently pecked at my pheromone suppression patch. Go home. Go home. The evening breeze blew through the garden. The tulips that Matthew had eradicated back then surged up from the ground like a sea. I held Michael's little hand tightly and left 2 rows of footprints in the flower field, like the marks of a knife cutting through chains.